I'm Joan Brzezinski, the director of the University of Minnesota China Center. I welcome you to today's webinar, From Nixon to Biden, What Has Gone Wrong with the Sino-American Relationship, with Dr. Yawei Liu. I thank you for joining us today and for your support of the China Center. Your generosity makes programs like this possible, and I offer special thanks to our supporters, Kai Mei and Joseph Terry, for their support of this program. We invite you to help us advance our mission and give to the China Center through the link on the webinar announcement or on our website. At the end of the program, we will have a Q&A session where you can submit your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. If you have any difficulty or any technical help, use the chat, but we won't answer questions in chat, so please put them in the Q&A. Well, as we wait with anticipation for Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to deliver his address on U.S. policy toward China, we are very fortunate to have with us today's speaker. I invite my colleague, Haiyan Wang, the Assistant Director of the China Center, to introduce him. Haiyan.
Thank you, Joan. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Yawei Liu. 15 years ago, when I was a graduate student, I worked for Yawei as an intern at the Carter Center. I still remember how much I learned from this great experience. Today, I'm very glad to see Yawei here as a speaker for the Considering China webinar series. Dr. Yawei Liu is the Senior Advisor for China at the Carter Center and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the Associate Director of the China Research Center in Atlanta and an adjunct professor of political science at Emory University. He is the founding editor of ChinaElections.org, which went online in 2002. He launched the U.S. China Perception Monitor websites in English and Chinese in 2014. Yawei earned his bachelor degree in English literature from Xi'an Foreign Languages Institute, master's in recent Chinese history from the University of Hawaii, and PhD in American history from Emory University. Now, without further ado, Dr. Yawei Liu.
Thanks, Joe, for your opening remarks, and thank you, Haiyan, for that generous introduction. So I'm Yawei Liu. I'm speaking to all of you from Atlanta at the Carter Center. Ambassador Qinggang tomorrow will visit with us. So for today's presentation, I want first to go personal, to talk about some personal experience, and then I'll go macro, largely to talk about quickly historical evolution of the relationship. And then I will, as the title suggests, I'll try to identify there are many problems with the relationship. I want to identify some of the main factors that impact this relationship. And lastly, I would like to go over some of the recommendations. So to go personal, I'm showing this picture of my college years. And this was during a spring break outing. Our class went to a nearby scenic place called Cuihuashan on the outskirts of Xi'an. And so in this picture, there are 21 classmates, and 13 of them now are in the US. I am right here if you cannot recognize me. So that's me here, 2 in Canada and 1 in France. I highlight this picture because I want to say that we're the generation that has benefited greatly from reform and opening up. And we will do everything possible wherever we are, to try not to allow China to go back to its first 30 years. It also highlights, the significant dividends of opening and reform that we have all enjoyed. That has not only made China better, it has also benefited the United States. It has also benefited the whole world. I have a very special connection with Minnesota. I first studied in University of Hawaii. I went there in 1987. During the first summer, my fellow graduate student, Tim Wamberger, said, do you like to work And of course, I want to bring my wife over. I like to work. I like to make some money so my wife can fly over. And he said, my mom and my dad, they were all retired. They lived in a small place called Brainerd, Minnesota. My mom knows the senior vice president of the local hospital called the St. Joseph Medical Center. Maybe she could find you a job. And so that whole summer, the summer of 1988, I was in Brainerd, Minnesota. And just last year, I returned to Brainerd. So if you look at the right side of this slide, that's the little house my American mom and dad lived when I was there. So I spent my whole summer over there. Dad passed away, and so I went to the National Guard cemetery in Little Falls, Minnesota, to pay my respect. And I also, because I realized that the house was now belonged to somebody else, because there are kids things outside. They're all very old. So I started calling, talking to the neighbor. Eventually, I found out that mom actually is in the memory center, which means she's losing memory in the senior home nearby. So I drove to the place. Mom, even though she's losing her memory, she still remembers my name. She doesn't remember where I'm from. I think she thought I was Korean because my friend, her son, Kim Womberg, was a Peace Corps in Korea, and they have a lot of Korean friends. So mom is 92 years old, and I told her I'll try to go back, either this year or next year to celebrate the birthday. So here on this slide, there are pictures. Here I want to quickly illustrate these pictures, if I may. So at the bottom, I'm shaking hands with the paramount leader of China. This is, I believe this is 2012, when after the 17th, after the 18th, after the party Congress that he was about to assume the paramount leadership. The picture with current president, that's an interesting picture. I didn't plan to take a picture with him. So this is when Xi Jinping visited the United States in September 2015, and Vice President Biden hosted a reception at the 7th floor of the State Department. So I was invited to that. So after the meeting, Biden walked around every table and shaking hands with everyone, and U.S. Ambassador then was with him. So I asked him to take a picture of us. So the picture is not very clear because it was a ZTE cell phone. Otherwise, it could be a better quality picture. And finally, the picture with Ambassador Cui Tiankai. That's actually in November 2019. I brought a letter from President Carter. This was at the Chinese embassy to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the educational exchange between U.S. and China. I'm going to bypass this picture, this slide, because there are too many pictures over here. What I want to talk about just briefly is the picture above 2014. So that was President Carter's last visit to China in September 2014. So he was there to celebrate the 35th anniversary of normalization of U.S. China relationship. He was there to celebrate the 65th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And he was also there to celebrate his 90th birthday. So in this picture, he was looking at the pictures of him and Deng Xiaoping and others with Deng's daughter. It was a very moving and touching moment. Deng Rong, the daughter of Deng Xiaoping, shared tears when President Carter recalled his meetings, particularly the visit by her dad during the Spring Festival of 1979. So not only I have a special connection with Minnesota, I think Minnesota also has a connection, unique connection with China. So I went through China Center of University of Minnesota sort of, chronology. I look at some of them. It's quite interesting. So the first one, if you look at the picture at the bottom right, so that's Professor Hu Shi that came to UN and delivered a speech on Chinese nationalism in 1938. 1938, that's a year after the Japanese launched an all-out war against China. Of course, fast forward to 1982, October of that year, I was just out of college when my province, Shanxi province, and Minnesota established a sister state relationship. At that time, it was quite active and vibrant. Now, I think it's probably very inactive or dormant because there's a lot of concern on the US side about China's sharp power, infiltrating local governments, and of course, engaging in subversive activities against the United States. And then in 2008, University of Minnesota established Confucius Institute. So you see the ribbon cutting over here. It is sad and unfortunate, most of the Confucius Institute now are closed. I think the last one in the state of Minnesota was in St. Cloud University, and that was closed at the end of last year. And finally, there's a smaller picture at the top featured, the then governor of Shanxi, who later became party secretary of the province. So he visited the campus of University of Minnesota in 2011. 9 years later, 2020 in July, he was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve. Basically, the sentence said, after this 2-year reprieve, it will be converted into a life sentence, no parole, no earlier release. In other words, this one-time higher rank government official and party leader is going to die in jail. He was charged and convicted of taking bribes worth roughly more than 100 million US dollars. And of course, he fell because of the anti-corruption campaign, which I will talk about a little later about this anti-corruption campaign. So now the second part of my presentation, as I said, I'm going to present a macro view of the evolution of this relationship. I will begin with 1921, when the Chinese Communist Party was founded. That organization appeared largely as a response to what President Wilson and the other Western leaders did 2 years ago in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference. China at the time, of course, joined the war against the Central Powers, against Germany and Austria-Hungary. So China came out as on the winning side, and China wanted the Jiaodong Peninsula, a German concession, to be returned to China. But Japan also wanted that prime concession, and eventually, long story cut short, President Wilson gave up, and Japan took over Jiaodong Peninsula. That made many Chinese scholars, intellectuals, those Chinese who want to rejuvenate the country, who want to get China out of the century of humiliation, realize that Western liberal democracy is hypocritical. There may be other alternatives to save China and they looked everywhere. They saw the October Revolution, they saw Lenin, and then they decided communism probably was the approach to save China. So I refer to this as an October Revolution moment, is when some of the Chinese elite realized that the United States did not provide a feasible approach for them to make China great again. They turned sharply to the left, which of course have huge consequences for China and for the world. So that's 100 years ago. And then 60 years ago, in 1962, most Americans probably remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. After Soviet Union collapsed, all the archives were declassified, and people were able to realize actually in October 1962, all the missiles installed in Cuba were nuclear warhead tipped and could be launched, and the entire eastern coast of the United States could just go up in flames in a nuclear shootout. And of course, both Khrushchev and Kennedy realized, they look into the crystal ball, they realized that not only the two countries, but the entire mankind was on the verge of a nuclear annihilation, and they backed down. However, at the time, talking about, in 1919, when Chinese elite were disillusioned and disappointed in the result of the Paris Peace Conference in 1962, one particular person was very much disappointed in the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was the paramount leader of China then, Mao Zedong. He actually would like to see a nuclear shootout between the U.S. And the Soviet Union. During his second trip to Moscow, while he was there, he told leaders from Eastern European countries and Soviet leaders that even if there was a nuclear war between the East and the West, China has 600 million people, at least 300 million would survive a nuclear blast. So there's nothing to be afraid of. So again, 60 years later today, when you hear Putin talking about possibly using tactical nuclear weapons, against Ukraine, so that we're not very far actually from another round of a nuclear warfare. How strange it is now to look at that. And of course, 50 years ago, this is the title of the presentation, from Nixon to Biden. So that ice-breaking trip to China that we, starting in late January all the way to the last month, organizations in China, think tanks, organized a lot of online and in-person activities to commemorate the trip. I want to call your attention to the picture at the bottom right is when Deng Xiaoping came over during the Spring Festival in 1979. Nixon, of course, in disgrace, resigned from the presidency, was invited to the White House to attend the state dinner when Deng Xiaoping was visiting. This was his first return to the White House after he left in August 1975. When, of course, no one wants to underestimate the significance of Nixon's ice-breaking trip to China, but I always tell people that what Nixon was able to do is to open the windows so that China and the U.S. could look at each other. President Carter actually made the real difference. He and Deng Xiaoping were the ones that opened the door so that people from the U.S. and people from China, they can travel to the other side. And I was one of them through the open door, I went to University of Hawaii, and then I lived and worked during the summer of 1988, and eventually I came down here to study at Emory, and then I got the good fortune of working for the very person who made my coming to the U.S. Possible. So why did Nixon do that? People always say, the wisdom of Nixon and the wisdom of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, that really made all the difference. I objectively speaking, I think the wisdom here belongs actually to President Richard Nixon, not necessarily to the Chinese leaders, because the Chinese leaders managed to get themselves into a situation that they were facing two enemies: the Soviet Union in the west, to the north, and also the U.S. to the east and the south. And China literally at the time was in 1969, as you can see, during the border clash in Heilongjiang, Moscow threatened and was thinking of using tactical nuclear weapons against China. So it was in that dire situation that Mao decided to wave an olive branch. But Nixon actually talked about bringing China into the global community as early as 1967. So Nixon basically felt that if China was not brought into the global community, if Chinese people and Chinese leaders remained upset and angry about the Western world, even though China at the time was economically very weak and politically unstable, but given the population of China, the size of China, and the potential of China evolving into a great power, it is absolutely necessary to bring China in. So this is the beginning of the so-called engagement policy, and this is the rationale. So I would like to just to read what Nixon wrote in that 1967 article. He said, "We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors." So this is Nixon, and this is Nixon's wisdom. And I think as a Chinese, and I think all Chinese, we should thank Nixon for his wisdom, for having this earlier vision that bringing China into the community of global community of countries is very, very important. And of course, as I said, Nixon wasn't able to normalize the relationship. That decision was not made until December 15 U.S. time, December 16 China time. I was a freshman at the college. When I heard the broadcast that the two countries are going to normalize their relationship effective January the 1st, 1979, I, like many of my college students, we were flabbergasted because we grew up being told our mission was to destroy the Western world, led by the U.S., the evil, corrupt, decadent power in the world. So we did not particularly understand why China would like to have a relationship with the United States. At the bottom right, you see the picture of Chinese leaders raising their hand. That's adopting the resolution at the 11th, the third plenum of the 11th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, 11届三中全会. So that's the opening, the beginning of the reform and the opening up. So, and that meeting concluded on December the 18th. So within three days, December the 16th in China, December the 18th, all in 1978, Deng Xiaoping and his supporters at the top of the Chinese Communist Party made two momentous decisions so that China is embarked upon a way that was very much different from its first 30 years. And of course, we can say the rest is history. If you look at this chart, it's just because of those two decisions, to normalize China's literally Chinese life, because for the first 30 years of PRC, everything was politicized, and now they declared class struggle was no longer the focus of the party. So the focus of the party is to allow people to engage in economic activities, not to persecute each other, not to engage in so-called ideological purification, and the talent, the energy, the innovation, the potential of the Chinese people, of the Chinese nation, therefore was emancipated. And of course, because of the other decision, normalization of relationship, there is capital, there's technology, all the Western countries after US made the first move, they all joined the chorus of engaging China, supporting China, with the hope that China, with their engagement, China will become closer in political system, in ideology to the Western system. So that, of course, is a big part of the relationship, which I'm going to skip, because I don't mean to say the relationship was smooth. Over the years from 1979 basically to 2009 to 2010, the relationship was largely productive and mutually beneficial, although there were moments of crisis, but the leaders were able to manage the relationship very, very good. So 2008, around that time, the Summer Olympic Games, and of course, China joined the WTO, and China economy started climbing up, eventually becoming the second largest economy. So all these things combined that made American leaders and Western leaders to rethink about the engagement policy. So here on this slide, I said, paradigm shift. So 2005, Robert Zoellick introduced the concept responsible stakeholder, that China and the US and other countries, they're responsible stakeholders in the global community. They're going to compete for sure, but they are going to cooperate, they're going to work together. I still think this probably is the best framework for the two countries to peacefully coexist and to fairly compete. But I don't know whether we can bring back Zoellick framework. But more and more, the other framework has begun to prevail over the decision makers in Washington, D.C. And that began with James Mann, who used to be a reporter for Los Angeles Times in or Washington Post in China. So in 2008, he published a little book called the China Fantasy. And what argument he had in that book is, he said, we Americans will have this fantasy. We think, with China becoming part of the market economy, the Chinese political system is going to change. The Chinese government is going to respect human rights and freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and things like that. He said, wake up, that is not going to happen. That's just a fantasy. And the China model, in James Mann's phrase, is shining wealth without liberty. That model poses a threat to American national security. And then Robert Blackwell, and CSIS and the Council on Foreign Relations, they issued a report in 2015 called "To Revise the Grand Strategy Toward China," and basically they said, now the engagement policy should come to an end. We need to hedge. We need to prepare for the scenario that the richer China is going to become, the more hostile China is going to be toward the U.S., toward the West, and that's very, very risky. And before this little pamphlet came out, Kurt Campbell was an assistant secretary of state for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, worked very hard to introduce the pivot, which I think now since President Trump went to the White House in 2017, and then President Biden in 2021, what they have been doing is the methodical implementation of the pivot envisioned by Kurt Campbell, who now is the Indo-Pacific SAR at the National Security Council. So very, very quickly around this time, there's also a Brookings study by the principal investigators of this report is on the American side is Ken Lieberthal, who worked in Clinton's National Security Council, and Professor Wang Jisi, who retired as Dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University, who actually recently came to the US to conduct exchange with American scholars. Unfortunately, he was held at the entry point for 4.5 hours. He was interrogated by the immigration officers because he was suspected of working for the Chinese intelligence agencies. And I think David Shenbaum, the professor at George Washington University, around 2015, 2016, wrote a very good op-ed in which he made the argument. He said the engagement coalition is crumbling and the competition coalition is rising. Certainly, he had this prior sense that things are going to change big time in Washington, D.C. But what he wrote in the op-ed, he said 3 pillars of engagement. I thought that's very useful for us to understand the American mindset, with Nixon and followed by all the presidents after him until, I think President Obama was a little wavering, but not until Trump and Biden when they started making the decisive move to disengage China. So the 3 pillars is that as China modernizes economically, it will liberalize politically. The second is responsible stakeholder vision that I just mentioned. And lastly, China would not challenge the American dominant security architecture and order in East Asia. Of course, when we look at what China has been doing, if we ignore the rhetoric part and look at things on the ground, these 3 pillars, ballasts, I think they are, they have not completely gone, but they're seriously eroded. And for the first pillar, I think it's not an issue of erosion. It's actually an issue of evaporation. It's not there anymore. So 50 years ago, Nixon went to China. 50 years later, if Nixon was still going to be around, he probably, I don't know, many Americans think, Nixon made a mistake. In the words of Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, is that no country in the world would help its potential challenger to grow powerful year by year, week by week, and day by day. So Nixon did make a comment to the New York Times columnist William Safire, and he said, we may have created a Frankenstein. Engaging China, of course, that comes out of a kindness. It comes out of, you can even argue, national self interest without realizing that you are empowering and enriching a country which does not share your values, which may challenge you eventually, and the likelihood of these two powers getting into a conflict is not a fallacy, if I may. So I talked about Trump and Trump in the China shop. I think that's a very apt allergy. And of course, where is President Biden? So people make a comparison, and sometimes they say the Biden-China strategy is Trump light, and there are others who say the Biden-China strategy is Trump plus. I think I would say it's Trump plus. The plus side refers to when Trump was around, he ridiculed the allies. He made fun of them. He did not try to make them part of the U.S. foreign policy. And when Biden went into the White House, he started rebuilding the allies, and he started rebuilding the partnerships, and he was able very successfully to bring Europeans, to bring Japan, to bring Australia, UK, all into the bandwagon of, if we can use the word, encircling China. So the interim national security strategy and the policy, Joan mentioned that Secretary of State Blinken is going to give a China policy speech. Last Thursday, he came down with COVID, just like Nancy was about to go to Taiwan. She came down with COVID. So COVID actually, I think, at least recently has saved U.S. China relationship to a large extent. But Blinken actually in March 2021, during his first major press conference, described the U.S. Policy toward China as competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. Now, Biden, during his first press conference, made the following remarks. I would like to read it because, if you put yourself into the shoes of the Chinese leaders, how are you going to react to that? President Biden said, China has an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch because the US is going to continue to grow. I don't think there's anything wrong with China becoming the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world. And it's not the business of US to try to stop China growing. You can criticize China. You can impose sanctions on China because China has done things that threaten US national security, blah, blah, blah. But just to make this kind of blanking statement, which is going to be understood by the Chinese leaders, is that US has a plan, and that plan is basically not only to contain China, but also to just like what happened to the Soviet Union, disintegration. And US probably will be happy to see the same thing happen to China. So there are of course many issues in terms of U.S.-China relations. Where are the factors that has turned this relationship into a free fall? But there are four factors that China has no intention whatsoever, really to deal with these issues in accordance with the wishes of the U.S. and other Western powers. One is Taiwan, the second is Hong Kong, third is what's going on in Xinjiang, and the fourth is South China Sea. So as long as these issues are going to be there, I don't think we can see, light at the end of the tunnel, which means, stabilization of the bilateral relationship. And of course, on top of that, there is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and China's unfortunate, or if I can use the word, erroneous position, not to condemn the invasion of Ukraine. I try to basically put themselves into the shoes of Putin and saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is justified. That, of course, is pitting China against, if not against the whole global trend, at least against the community of developed countries. As you can see, the solidarity of NATO countries, solidarity of EU countries, as shown in the picture on the left bottom. So quickly, 2022, this year, clearly is going to be a very critical year for China domestically, but also for China internationally. At the top, you see China Evergrande. That symbolizes, the instability and possibly, the danger of the real estate market in China. If that happens, I think it's probably going to be no less than what happened, the financial tsunami in Wall Street in 2008. And under that, you see Fu Zhenhua and Sun Lijun, these are top national security officials that all came down on corruption charges. It basically makes people wonder, what's going on in China, because the indictment of Fu Zhenhua, who used to be Gong'an Buchang and later Sifa Buchang, is that he was never loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. So the question is, then if you are never loyal to the Chinese Communist Party, how come you are able to climb up that high? Unless we have to say that your mechanism, personnel promotion, is probably seriously flawed. What I want to say here is the weaponization of anti-corruption, basically to silence any dissent and opposition within the party or outside the party. And of course, Shanghai crackdown, lockdown. I think you probably can use the crackdown, the word too. And of course, finally, is the 20th Party Congress, the leadership change. And that certainly, the whole world, maybe there won't be a change at the top, but who else will be surrounding the top is still subject to a lot of rivalry internally within the party. And as George Kennan, in his long telegram back in 1947, he said, we really don't have to worry about Soviet Union coming on top during the Cold War, because there are multiple reasons. And one reason George Kennan highlighted is that that system is not going to have a peaceful, predictable, safe transfer of power. So this again, China is still facing this daunting challenge of the transfer of power. So I want to end my presentation by saying that what's the most dangerous factor in the relationship. The relationship, of course, is very, very bad now. There are many things, as I said earlier, that are preventing this relationship from being stabilized. But what's more volatile is what I call the clash of perceptions. Samuel Huntington had that famous book called The Clash of Civilizations. Maybe the U.S. and China eventually will get into a clash of civilization. But before that clash happened, what's more dangerous is the clash of perceptions. So the U.S. perception of China, which I think, it's understandable, but it's paranoid, it's unjustified, it's flawed, it's problematic, and that perception is that China now is the only country in the world that poses a threat to the U.S., a direct and existential threat to the U.S. diplomatically, ideologically, scientifically, technologically, however you want to say that. I even after Russia invaded Ukraine, the defense strategy that was released by Pentagon still labels China as threat number one. So that I think it's problematic. Now, on the other side of the Chinese perception, so the Chinese perception, there are two things. Number one is the consistent perception that United States has a plan to subvert China, to contain China, and to eventually make China disintegrate. But on top of that is this newly emerged blind confidence that China is going to be on the winning side when they look at the pandemic getting out of control here in the US, when they look at what happened on January the 6th on the steps and the inside Capitol, when they look at the partisan fight here in the US, when they look at the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, they somehow believe the days of the supremacy of the United States are numbered, and time and momentum, 时与时, are on the China side, and 东升西降, the East is rising and the West is falling. That earlier perception plus this blind confidence, that's the big problem. And misperception will lead to miscalculation, and miscalculation certainly will bring the number one and number two economies in the world, into a conflict. Whether it's the economic conflict, in the words of Trump, economic war has been raging all these years between U.S. and China. Tariff is still there. But of course, what's more dangerous is going to be this ideological competition or rivalry. But of course, the worst danger would be accidental shooting. And of course, with Ukraine being invaded, many here in the U.S. may be thinking that China, if China follow the steps of Putin and make a decision to use force against Taiwan, that's actually not so bad as far as American interests are concerned. So I will stop here, and I welcome your questions. And so now the floor is open. Joan will moderate.
Thank you so very much for this excellent presentation and just such a lot of information. I'm going to digest this for several days. So we do have a lot of questions, so let's get started. You mentioned the possible U.S. goal of China someday experiencing a disintegration similar to that of the Soviet Union. Given the path Russia has taken after the Soviet collapse, including Putin's current aggression in Ukraine, do you feel the U.S. should have a different goal? If so, what would you advise?
I don't have, I have a few more slides. I don't have time to talk about it. I think, engaging China is until today, I think, for Secretary Pompeo, President Biden and others to say that engagement is a failure, that engagement has made China stronger and has made China pose a threat to the US. I think that's irrational. Engagement is a positive thing. Engagement is a good thing. What can be better? If you look at what happened in the past 50 years or 43 years after the relationship was normalized, we see prosperity, we see peace. Nothing is better than this. Engagement policy, as I mentioned earlier, has benefited China for sure, has benefited the United States, and has benefited the whole world. I don't think, I can accept any statement or view saying, President Nixon, President Carter, and all the presidents that followed them made a mistake. So that takes us to the second issue here, which is the foundation for the new, for the shift. That is, engagement has failed to change China. But changing China, I don't think that's the, in the words of Ambassador Stapleton Roy, it's not the business of America. Nobody can really change China unless Chinese people, Chinese leaders decide to change themselves. To see China disintegrate like the Soviet Union, I think that will be disaster, not only for China, but for the entire world. I think all credit should be given to the leaders of China for, since 1949, there are problematic moments, periods, but overall, the country is unified. People, particularly the recent 43 years, their living conditions are improving. 300 million people were lifted out of poverty, and China has engaged the world, particularly developing world, productively. Although again, there are issues that we can discuss. So to bring chaos back to China is going to be a disaster for everyone involved. So the U.S. policy toward China is, you hope that China is going to improve for the better. But I think President Biden has made that very clear, is regime change is not the business of the United States. But I think that lingering doubt on the part of China is still there, and they look at the actions on the ground. They all can be interpreted that these are not just expression of disapproval. There's certainly more sinister ideas behind U.S. actions. So again, I don't think U.S. is publicly saying we want to make the regime change in China, but a lot of Americans certainly are happy to see that. But I think the U.S. position on this issue must be made very clear, that we're not in the business of regime change in China. And we, as President Biden has mentioned repeatedly, we need to put guardrails on this relationship so that it's not going to veer into conflict.
Okay, the second question I have is, through globalization, the economies of the two countries have become more entangled and interdependent, which means trade and financial weapons that the U.S. can deploy often end up hurting both countries. Do you see that as perhaps a moderating force in the conflict, or is this not sufficient to rein in the desire to rush into another Cold War across the Pacific?
It is. I think not only the people-to-people exchange. Chinese students continue to come to study over here, even during the pandemic. Of course, Americans are not allowed to travel to China, and very few American students are able to go to China. The business to business, the logistics, the supply chain, all of these are interwoven, interconnected, and they have become a huge stabilizing force when the relationship is so unstable. However, I think to a large extent, decoupling may happen if China said, now, of course, I mentioned earlier, U.S. government has not removed the tariff, because the consensus is tariff is hurting both countries, and tariff is hurting American citizens. Tariff is hurting American businesses. but the Chinese export into the US has not come down at all. Actually, last year, it was a new record. So which all shows, this interconnectedness, interdependence is there. However, I would say that if China, say, moves further to the left, I think there's a recent decision that no Western hardware and software can be used by Chinese government agencies or state-owned enterprises. The Chinese strong desire to manage the free flow of capital. The Chinese government call for common prosperity. And of course, this irrational measures because of zero COVID approach, like the shutting down of Tesla in Shanghai and those decisions. If American businesses, which 70% of them, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in the last survey, are still making money in China. So they don't want to leave. But if the government creates a perception that it makes all these decisions that can cripple either a domestic business or a foreign business, then I think that's the moment of reckoning may happen. And I think next 5 years will be a test to see whether the Chinese government continue to embrace the market economy, to allow the market, of course, not without supervision, but to allow the market to play the more important regulation role rather than the government intruding itself. If the Chinese government becomes too intrusive, then regardless of how interdependent and interconnected, our economy, our trade is, this is going to fall apart. And that, I guess in addition to the war between the two countries is the other source of huge concern and worry for many of us, who continue to benefit from a peaceful coexisting arrangement between the two countries.
So kind of along this line, what areas do you think possess the most possibility in terms of collaboration and cooperation? Would you think that the common ground for the two governments to agree on something like climate change or agriculture? What other fields do you feel that would be the potential, highlights in this area?
I've spent all these years at the Carter Center, trying to promote U.S. China collaboration, cooperation, or at least, coordination. So there are many, many areas. Climate change, of course, is, last November, U.S. and China signed a joint statement. They're going to work together to engage in climate change. Pandemic, I think this is an area where, by all means, U.S. and China should work together. But because of the origin of the issue, because of the lack of transparency issue, and so there is no trust. Even if U.S. and China cannot work on the current pandemic because of lingering suspicion and anger toward each other, U.S. and China should start working on how to prevent the next pandemic. CDC actually should request to return to China, and China actually should allow the CDC experts, to go to China so that they can talk to their the counterpart. The other area of potential and very important collaboration, of course, is North Korea. The nuclear proliferation, North Korean leaders are lonely because they think they're neglected because of the war, because of U.S.-China rivalry. So they kept firing missiles. And that's where U.S. and China, I think U.S. and China have to, if you really want to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. And also in developing countries, particularly in Africa, U.S. and China can collaborate. So there are numerous areas, but the challenge now is neither side have any trust on the other side. So there's no movement, although there are so many areas that two countries can cooperate. And our next project is actually to identify and design specific area, maybe however small it is, for U.S. China to work on, with an implementation plan, and then we're going to present to both sides, and with the hope that at least you can introduce these measures so that you can contact each other, start having a dialogue, and then moving cautiously to any possible coordination first and then cooperation.
We have a couple of questions asking a little bit about the U.S. perception of China being as dangerous as it is ill-formed. And then another one just simply wanted to know these perceptions leading to more dangerous relationship or situations where we need to be really extra concerned, I guess.
Our website is called U.S. China Perception Monitor. That's why I also emphasize misperceptions, how detrimental, how dangerous it is going to be. I think both sides need to really look at the other side and try to gain a better understanding of what's going on the other side. So for the China side, I think they should abandon this habit. It's now everything that happens in the world. If it's bad, U.S. is behind it, literally, and as if that people in Ukraine or people in China or people in Hong Kong, people wherever they are, they have no agency whatsoever. People took to the streets in Hong Kong. Oh yeah, because they're mobilized, they're instigated by the Americans. Ukraine went to war, or Russia invaded Ukraine because U.S. was pushing Putin to do that, because U.S. have other ulterior motives. So I think for the Chinese side, they need to give up. I don't think they will be able to give up, but they need to moderate, that kind of suspicion that U.S. is not omnipresent. It's not everywhere. It's not everything happens because U.S. is pulling the string. The second is China needs to have a very objective assessment of your national capacity, your force, what you can do to make the argument that time and momentum are on your side. I think that's probably misleading, and that's also dangerous. On the American side, I think to say that China poses the biggest threat ever, I think that's not well-grounded assessment. China has so many problems. To say that China is going to overtake the U.S. In the matter of years, to say that China is determined to edge out the U.S. out of Western Pacific or East Asia, it's just if it's not exaggeration, if it's not paranoia, it's exaggeration. So both sides need to work very hard to have a better understanding of the inner workings of both of the other country, so that they can draw a more informed, more objective assessment of the other, so that a better decision could be made by the leaders on both sides.
I agree. We had Ryan Haas on this program some time ago, and his book Stronger, I think, really illustrates the number of strengths the U.S. has in this relationship, and that people are panicking, I think, to no end. What do you think the role of higher education is in keeping this people-to-people relationship going? And do you have any sort of concerns about the Chinese youth and this little pink or this sort of nationalism that is coming up through that generation?
We recently published a report called Finding Firmer Ground, the role of higher education in U.S. China relationship. So for anyone, I think one of the authors, Yongling, is in the audience. So if you're interested in the report, you go to uscmpm.org. You'll be able to download that report. I think, me myself came to the U.S. as a student. Me myself, I'm a walking example of how important, higher education exchange is in bringing the two people closer, in increasing mutual understanding between the two countries, and to be a bridge between the two countries, and the role we can play are important, particularly when the relationship is in trouble as it is now. Of course, I think the U.S. door is much more open than that of the China side. China should do more to attract more American students to study in China. And of course, we don't even know now when COVID, the shutting down of China, when China is going to reopen, it's unknown here. But I just, talking about how important it is, I just want to cite a recent survey of people in China and people in Russia in terms of how you see the other country. Although China and Russia recently formed the No Limit Partnership, only 28% of people in China see Russia as an ally. Only 28% of the people in Russia. And only 36% of the people in Russia see China as an ally. So although there is this government push for a closer relationship, this relationship has no people-to-people foundation. Whereas U.S. China relationship has a very strong people-to-people foundation. However, that's what I warn is that I'm concerned that this people-to-people foundation is going to falter because increasing number of Chinese are seeing U.S. as an enemy because of what has happened since Trump got into the White House. So, but again, I think we need to give credit to President Biden. While he was in the White House in the early months, he made the decision to issue visas to Chinese students. And I think another executive order was given that China students are now can apply for visas to come over here. So I'm very hopeful this people-to-people exchange will continue as long as they are in place. This relationship, this course of memory, of emotional interaction. They're going to be strong anchors for this relationship, however difficult it is.
We have a number of questions that are sort of related topic in the sense that the U.S. Chinese Americans are facing more discrimination and injustice because of Chinese heritage due to the tensions in the U.S.-China relationship. And you can see it in the U.S. based Committee of 100 saying higher percent of Americans doubt the people of Chinese heritage have loyalty to the U.S. And just what can the ordinary Chinese people studying, working, or living in the U.S. do to cope with this situation, and or what other thoughts might you have on this subject?
We don't need to go too far to see what's the official position of at least of the national security and intelligence community of the U.S. Their perception of Chinese Americans or Chinese students or Chinese scholars. Christopher Wray, back in 2018, basically said, every 10 hour, FBI opens a case involving a Chinese American or Chinese national espionage or stealth of American intellectual copyright. This year, on the eve of Chinese New Year, he made exactly the same remarks at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And 2 weeks ago, during a 48-hour CBS interview, he made the same remark. I don't think Christopher Wray can say these things without authorization, without support from Attorney General, without support from the White House, even though China Initiative name has been dropped, mission might have been revised. So, this suspicion of Chinese Americans is there, and U.S. Passed the law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, back in 1882. So it happened in history. I don't think it's going to happen like in the same format as it was in 1882, but there could be very drastic measures against me, against other Chinese Americans. We were born in China for sure, but we came here. We love this country. We were naturalized citizens, and we're keenly aware we are probably living and working under a gathering cloud. But I think we should not be afraid. This is a democracy. This is a country where we can make our voice heard. This is the AAPI Heritage Month. Just the number of webinars, lectures, activities, meetings, designed to protect Asian American rights, to make other Americans, informed, how vital our contributions are to this great nation. I think this kind of civic engagement, mobilization, education will have to continue until one day that there is no government suspicion of us anymore, and that day probably is very far down the road. But we have to work. We have to work very hard. About the meeting, can you just
Okay.
in the window?
All right, sorry about that. I think we should probably start to wrap up here. We have a few more questions, and I appreciate everyone coming today. We welcome you to attend our webinar. If you have to duck out in the end of the summer, we should be back. And I encourage you to take our survey that will follow this particular presentation about our whole series and tell us what you like, what you don't like. It'll definitely, your input will have value to what we plan for the next year. So one other question that came up here is there a way out of zero-sum thinking about the China-US relationship? Besides yourself and other thought leaders, are there politicians or academics and others actors in the U.S. today that are allies that are helping us move forward with this relationship?
Again, this is probably similar to my answer to the question of where U.S. and China could cooperate. I think to remove the zero-sum mentality, both sides. I think both sides, both leaders and their advisors are now literally possessed by the idea that the other side is there to undercut us, to contain us, to interrupt us. And as long as that thinking is around, as long as diplomats, particularly I think from the China side, to criticize the US day in, day out. And as long as China side continues to make the case for Russia, as long as Americans' sanctions, tariff are in place, as long as US is doing everything to make a Chinese company like Huawei, just to go down, I think that zero-sum mentality will be there, and it's daunting. So we have to be patient. We have to be very diligent, and we have to seize every moment. So I do, as someone who wants to see U.S. China closer, every time a coordinated effort happens, I'm thrilled. For example, at the United Nations, U.S. and China, after the coup in Myanmar, U.S. and China, their ambassadors at the UN agreed that no invitation was going to be given to Myanmar to have a new ambassador to come over here. That's a very small step, but it's a very important step, is that at least you guys are coordinating. I think the two countries can do many things together. For example, to provide humanitarian support to the people in Myanmar. U.S. has a large presence there, USAID, and as well as U.S. international organizations. And China has vital economic interest in Myanmar. China has supplied vaccines to Myanmar. So one day I heard American officials say, if China is providing vaccine, we do have the network. We can make sure these vaccines can get into the individuals of Myanmar, because we're working with other international organizations, and Chinese government doesn't really have a network. They basically dump the thing, to the government. This is a very small step. If both sides have confidence in the other side, this can be easily worked out. And the other example, of course, talking about pandemic, is in West Africa when Ebola happened. President Obama instructed Susan Rice to call her counterpart in China, saying, there is this outbreak. We Americans were going to go there. We hope you guys are also going to go there. And President Xi Jinping took the call and said, yes, we'll be there. And both Americans and the Chinese were in West Africa. They played a vital role in containing that outbreak. It's things like this. You can build up confidence, and you can reduce this suspicion. Because I truly believe both Americans and the Chinese, they are for peace. They are for stability everywhere. They are for prosperity, and things can be worked out. And many people say I'm too naive, but I would say, then what's the opposite of naivete? If you're going to allow this relationship, to slide, and where is the end going to be? And that end may be very horrifying.
Thank you very much for your time today, and we really appreciated you joining us for this webinar. This was fantastic, really outstanding, and I really look forward to reading your next report. And thanks so very much, and thank everyone for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks.